Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If you're in the government construction space, you've probably heard the term IGE or independent government estimate before. If you're looking to learn about what an IGE is and why it matters, common scenarios that trigger IGEs, how to evaluate whether change order pricing is reasonable, the role of RS means and why validation is still critical, and how RFIs can signal upcoming change orders, you're in the right place. My name is Noah Baldwin. I'm the Director of Procurement here at ACE Consulting, not the procurement of logistics and material and supply transportation, but more so the procurement of providing services to the government. I oversee and manage projects direct to government, do a lot of work with the National Park Service, manage construction management representatives out in the field, which is why I'm familiar with independent government estimates. I do a lot of work facilitating the process behind putting those together, reviewing those for our government clients. So stick around if you want to later hear from an expert as far as putting IGEs together. That's going to be Kyle Thacker, our Director of Project Controls. He's going to come on later and show you exactly the bones of how to put together a comprehensive IGE. But before we get to that, again, I'm going to give you some background on what an IGE is, when it's needed, and kind of the process behind facilitating one. In government construction, for the most part, where you're going to see an IGE is most often with change orders or modifications to an already awarded contract. This is going to help the project owner to validate change in costs or additional money given to a contractor that has already awarded a project. The reason that this is necessary is because there's not competition from external sources or competitors within the industry, because it's not a project that's out for bid. It's a project that's already been awarded. And again, change order pricing, whether it's site conditions, whether it's, weather impacts, there are a number of different things that could impact or onset a change order within a project. And that is where the government will reach out to the contractor to have them put together an estimate. An IGE is going to be what the project owners use to validate that pricing from the contractor. The process behind putting together an IGE might seem rather bureaucratic, and that's because it is. Government agencies, when they're spending money, they're spending taxpayer money, and it's their job to do their due diligence and show that they are spending taxpayer money reasonably within their obligation to demonstrate that funds are being spent responsibly. That's where an IGE comes in to show that proposed costs are reasonable, scope changes are justified, negotiations are supported with data, procurement decisions are defensible, and the government is not solely reliant on contracted pricing, which we all know can be marked up at times. So in many ways, the IGE acts as the government's financial reality check. Without a well-developed estimate, agencies can find themselves negotiating blindly, accepting unsupported pricing, or even underestimating the true impacts of project conditions or the risk associated with. So a good IGE creates leverage and a poor IGE creates exposure. We've already kind of touched on it, but I'll dive a little bit deeper into when IGEs are needed. It's a misconception that IGEs are only needed at the beginning of a project. In reality, again, we see more IGEs in our current position at ACE during the project with change orders. So this can happen with unforeseen site conditions, with excavation, things of that nature. This can take place when requests for equitable adjustment are being negotiated, time extension impacts, things of that nature. So specific to the National Park Service, which is who we do a lot of work with, we see IGEs that are specific to working in remote or environmentally sensitive areas, working with historic structures. You're subject to difficult logistics as far as material transport. You're constrained by seasonal access. If you're doing work in the Rockies, you have snow seasons where that could significantly impact getting material or crews to and from site. So now we'll kind of move into the IGE, the life cycle. At the earliest stages, you'll see a rough order of magnitude or an ROM to determine whether funding is available, whether the change in the project is feasible, rather, how funds should be prioritized. And this moves you into the putting together the IGE. We've been over kind of what an IGE is, when it's needed. So now we'll go into kind of what makes a good IGE right before we jump into, again, Kyle Thacker with ACE, showing you kind of how he puts the bones of one together. Again, a good IGE is something that's well documented, it's transparent, it's defensible, it's current. You have to factor in current market rates, current market prices as far as material. It's logical, it's based on actual project conditions, and it is consistent with current industry standards. So most importantly, it just demonstrates that the numbers behind the estimate are reasonable. An IGE should never be viewed as just paperwork. It's really a professional analysis that supports and protects both the agency and the taxpayer. So a good estimate tells a story of what work is being performed, why the costs cost what they cost, what assumptions were made, if there's any risks associated, and really how the final value was determined. Some of the most common challenges or fallbacks, pitfalls you'll see with IGEs are estimates that are developed too quickly, failure to account for all site conditions, reliance on outdated pricing, lack of labor productivity adjustments, poor documentation, failure to account for logistics, over reliance on tools such as RS means. RS means can be a great tool, but again, it is just that, and you still need to verify again industry standards, industry current situations. And then you also, when you're putting together an IG, you need to consider the impact on the project schedule. That's a big pitfall that is often overlooked. So ultimately, IGs are one of the foundational tools in federal construction management. They support better procurement decisions, improve negotiation outcomes, they strengthen project controls, and help agencies maintain accountability throughout the project cycle. While developing an IG requires a technical estimating skill, it also requires judgment, experience, and a deep understanding of current project conditions and construction operations. So with that foundation in place, we're going to transition to the next portion of this webinar, where Kyle Thacker will discuss the practical side of building an effective independent government estimate. Or if you're a contractor watching this, he will show you kind of how to build an estimate of your own so that the negotiations are more coherent. You'll have a better understanding of kind of how the government approaches this, which will effectively give you more ammunition and experience when it comes to putting together your estimate, so that again, negotiations are easier and it is easier to get change orders awarded and things of that nature. So no further ado, please welcome Kyle Thacker.
Good afternoon. My name's Kyle Thacker. Appreciate the intro there, Noah. I'm our Director of Project Controls here at X Consulting. And before we get to the IGE phase, you mentioned kind of the rough orders of magnitude, and I think it's a really important place for people to start their understanding. As a government agency, like any owner, any agency, they have certain budgets, right, that they're trying to stay within. They have different structures that are put in place that essentially equate to how that project is funded. If you're in government contracting, the FAR is typically going to dictate certain thresholds for, allocations of money, or if it's through grants or whatever legislation Congress passes, there could be a whole host of things that determines how a project is funded. And so, to Noah's point, when we work with either government agencies or work with contractors who are working with those agencies, one of the very first things that we like to talk about is, how is your project funded? Was it funded through a specific passing of legislation, or was it funded through some local county ordinance? All of those things are important. Why? Because it's going to essentially allude to how much spare capital that project may have. Take Corps of Engineers, for example. They have P3 contracts, public-private partnership contracts, right? Where a portion of it's funded by the government, a portion of it's it's funded by private industry. And so you can get into some really complicated scenarios there with where the money is actually coming from. And so before an IGE is essentially started, it's up to contracting officer, the owner's side, essentially their project management team. It's up to them to kind of determine, is this even within the budget? Can we actually go back and get additional funds, or are our funds capped at a certain level throughout the project? Noah mentioned the term, just kind of the rough orders of magnitude. These are, we hear these all the time. These are essentially shoot from the hip numbers. To put it just bluntly, it's shoot from the hip. Do we think this is going to cost us $20,000? Do we think this is going to cost us $250,000? Do we think it's going to cost us $2.5 million? Is it going to be done in 2 months, 6 months, or a year? Is that even feasible in the first place, or do we need to basically go back and kind of reevaluate our means and methods here? Is this really what the end user needs? Is this really what we're trying to accomplish, or did this just kind of really throw a wrench in the works for us and make it kind of difficult for us to really proceed? So whenever we're talking about the very first step, the very first thing that happens with an IGE, it's first establishing that rough order of magnitude. If you're coming at this from, again, the government side, or if you're coming at this from the contractor side, communication is everything. It's early discussions, it's early conversations, bringing issues up in meetings as early as possible, because as you use your proper channels, RFIs, to kind of communicate back and forth or just in your regular weekly meeting notes, things like that. It's really important to be transparent and upfront with where you expect these costs to be. If that's, again, if you're the contractor trying to inform the government, vice versa. If the government is trying to figure out how this is going to proceed going forward, communication on that piece is key. And so as your project develops, there's probably going to be a list saved somewhere. And if we would highly recommend that you keep a list of sort of rough orders of magnitude on prior projects that you can refer back to as you collect your database of prior information, historical information. Also, just know that there's probably going to be a list of rough order of magnitude prices on your project as it develops, because again, there has to be some benchmark for, is this still even in the cards for us at the given time in the contract, or are we going to have to, purchase this under a separate contract, under a separate task order? So just something to keep in mind. And so once the decision has been made to essentially proceed with an IGE, now things really start moving, right? It'll go from being just a conversation to more of an actionable step. So if you are a contractor watching this, you're going to get the green light to proceed with providing your estimate. Not the IGE, but you're going to be asked to put together your pricing. What do you think it's going to cost to install this wall? What do you think it's going to cost to move this window to the other side of the building? You will know what that directive is based on the discussions that you have with your chain of command. But the very first step is, okay, once we've agreed that we think we can either find the funding or make it work, now the discussion is going to go back to the contractor and they're going to say, let's start the estimate process. And so the government at that point, or your owner, agency, whoever it is, they're going to provide to you as detailed a scope of work as they can that has expectations outlined to, again, what is our end result? What are we trying to achieve? All of the sort of clauses incorporated by contract. They're gonna build you out that roadmap that you can then go and that you can go price, and that's is step number one. And so if we think about this in terms of a triangle, essentially in government contracting, you just solved one side of that triangle. That'd be if you have the government agency at the top, then call it the lower right hand side. That is going to be secured by the contractor that's out there working in the field and actually building the structure or renovating the structure. Where the IGE portion comes in is on the other bottom corner of that triangle. That's going to be the independent government estimate. And that's going to be, a firm that is able to kind of look at this from a 10,000-foot view. And they're also going to put together this benchmark pricing. Again, it's pretty simple, right? You're trying to determine whether or not it's reasonable, whether or not it's feasible, whether or not you're actually doing what you need to do in spending taxpayer money wisely. And so these two estimates, the IGE and the contractor's estimate, both parts, those are going to take place simultaneously, and everybody's going to be working off the same information. We all understand that this window is moving from this side of the building going to that side of the building, or we all know that our building's square footage of our concrete estimate is going to increase by X amount, right? Everybody has to work off the same page, and then hopefully everybody's going to come together and have the same numbers. So there's really no secret sauce. That's what we're trying to do early on. In our experience, probably the biggest thing that gets miscommunicated at this point is really the understanding of the IGE process. And by that, I mean the negotiation phase of the estimate itself. We do a lot of work with the National Park Service, which is Department of Interior. You also see this Department of Energy, Corps of Engineers. All of them kind of have their own specific template that they like to use. But you'll hear acronyms like record of negotiation. You will hear pre-negotiation objectives. You'll hear all these things. And people say, well, what is that? Well, it's essentially a glorified Word document, just to put it bluntly. It's a Word document that ensures a clear decision-making framework as these numbers are developed, right? Here's the contractor's price. Here's the independent government estimate price. And then here is the difference between the two. That leads us to the next question. Okay, well, if there is a difference, how much? How far off are our prices? And then what do we do about that? Was the IGE too low? Was the contractor's price too high? Did we miss something in our initial scope of work? Nobody factored in a certain distance, a certain span, something like that, and we need to go at and relook at these prices again. What are we trying to do? We're trying to make sure that we have a repeatable, scalable system in place that can ensure that that money, again, be too high, too low. You have to have some kind of a benchmark essentially to make it work. And we're going to kind of talk about some of those here. So, like I mentioned earlier, your project is probably going to have a running list of these rough order of magnitude prices that are more than likely going to correspond with RFIs or ASI, that type of back and forth communication between the designer and the contractor. Is we're trying to piece together: are we being reasonable about these costs? Are we applying this framework logically? Those type of questions. The next thing that's going to come up is, well, what all do we actually include on the IGE? Again, it's going to depend primarily on the type of procurement that you're dealing with. If there are FAR clause limitation, it's going to vary a lot, but in saying that, probably the first thing that's going to happen is your government agency, they are going to essentially determine what all falls underneath this proposal, right? It's essentially a modification proposal, but they're going to take those rough order of magnitude prices. Let's just say it's 6 RFIs, rough order of magnitude for these different items. And they're going to say, okay, we're going to put all of these onto one modification. And this is what we're going to price. This is how everybody's going to price it. And that's really good for a couple of reasons. One, it sort of streamlines the back and forth communication, because let's just say it's RFI 2, 5, and 7. There's your first 3, and then 14, 15, 16, right? Let's just say that all those 6 correspond with this one modification. They all correspond with, in our example, moving the placement of a window. Let's just say. So all of those RFIs are going to be part of this modification. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we cross-reference the drawings that were in our baseline contract, run to cross-reference any sort of RFI questions from the contractor or ASI information from the top down. We're going to make sure that all of that is incorporated in the overall scope of work that says, and again, in our example, moving the location of this window. So as this is taking place between all 3 points in our triangle, the government agency at the top, the government contractor at the one bottom corner, and then our independent government estimator, they're going to use an IGE template. Now, you can Google these all day long. There's no one specific template. You just need to use the template that's applicable to either your government agency or the one as directed by your contracting officer. You can just simply Google search IGE template, and you will find a ton of different templates for different ones. So you share my screen here real quick as we kind of go in. We're used to primarily working with the Department of the Interior. And so I just, again, searched for an IGE template, and lo and behold, what happens? We've got IGE templates for Department of Interior, ESA, or the Defense Acquisition University, different training materials, past examples. You can look at these all that you want, but let's just click on this one here, because again, I'm very familiar with this one. And in this case, we have a sort of a hyperlinked example to the independent government cost estimate, and it takes you to this particular Excel file, which is what we're looking at on the side of my screen here. So, and this is all it is. Again, there's no magic sauce to it, but it's we want to make sure that we have all these categories covered, so that it makes sense for price justification and things like that. So I'm going to center my screen, actually minimize this and go full scale. So like any estimate, you're going to have sort of the overall details for the project. What type of procurement is this? What's the project ID? What's the period of performance? All those kind of things. It's going to vary. You could create your own template if you wanted. Most government agencies are going to have a template that they're going to follow. And we break it down into these specific categories: direct labor, any equipment purchases, if there's purchasing any software or any kind of, licensing for things like that, any other direct cost, examples, travel or office materials, things like that, as well as a few to be determined items. Again, this is a very simplistic look at this. I understand there's probably general contractors watching this, and they understand their estimate, their bid sheet is all divisions, right? Division 2, Division 22, Division 16, whatever. Take your pick, right? You could set this up however you want to. I'm just showing you what the process is from somebody who would typically put together the IGE, and they would be comparing this against the contractor's estimate. So one of the biggest things that we see that leads to discrepancies in price is really this direct labor category. Oftentimes, contractors will submit their pricing with what they pay their people, which you would think, yeah, that makes sense. But let's actually take a step back and look at this from the government's perspective. It's very hard to, with a broad brush, paint how much the cost of labor is from company to company, right? Your construction company may pay someone a lot differently than the next construction company, or a contractor in Phoenix, Arizona is going to price their work a lot differently than somebody that lives in Pennsylvania. So how does the government get around this? How do they kind of, again, build that? It's all based on Davis Bacon, some prevailing wage rates. One of the questions that we often get asked is what happens whenever a contractor is already paying above Davis Bacon? Well, really what's going on there is that contractor, believe it or not, they're really supposed to absorb that cost. And you say, well, that's crazy. I'm not saying that it hasn't happened, but I'm saying that the way that the government applies this framework to their IGEs is that they don't have any other metric to go off of. They have to use, by law, Davis Bacon. So if they say it's X amount an hour for a laborer or for an equipment operator or supervisor, whatever that is, that's the rate that has to be included. So you get into these back and forth negotiations all the time between contractor and government of who's that actually on, and check your local procurement. But I would just say to you that falls on a cost that essentially is absorbed by the GC, not by the government. If you choose to pay $20 over David's Bacon, you don't get to reflect that in your IGE. So it's something to keep in mind whenever you're putting one of these things together. The government follows the regulation. The regulation is Davis Bacon. So when you're coming up with these prevailing wage rates, just understand that if you put in $700 an hour because you want to pay your people the absolute best that you can pay them, that's great. It's not going to help you, right? So just keep that in mind whenever you're filling out these labor rates. Equipment purchases or equipment rentals. Again, some of this is up to you as the reviewer. Do you feel like it makes more sense to purchase the equipment as opposed to rent it? If you're going to rent it, what's the rental period? Things like that. It's no different than any other estimate, right? You're compiling all this information, you're going through line by line and making sure that you have something covered in here for it, because you want to get this as close as you possibly can to the other nine. If you're the contractor, you want it to be close to the IG. If you're doing IG, we want it to be close to the general contractor, because it just that's a sign of proper planning. That's a sign of proper coordination. You don't want to have these wild discrepancies between the two. So hopefully this makes sense. Again, there's no real magic sauce to filling one of these things out. And another thing too, I'm just kind of reading this. So typically for contract modifications, the way that the contracts are set up, obviously the contractor's allowed to price in escalation in some cases, depending on how long this goes. If it's a 3-year contract, you'd have to read your contract language to determine what that escalation rate is. For example, in this one, it's showing, 3.5% to 4% off to the side here, just a note. Additionally, there are limitations to the amount with which you can mark up a subcontractor quote. So your specifications, your contract will spell that out, but know that that's something that you need to confirm before you start putting this together, is that everybody has the same percentage added to, your overhead and profit. So that way, again, it just cuts down on this discrepancy. Well, why was this price so much higher? Why was this price so much lower? The labor costs and subcontractor markups, in my opinion, are the two most common. For the most part, material purchasing, equipment rentals, things like that, that's a pretty easy takeoff to do, right? So just things to keep in mind there. And then the next thing that I wanted to show, so after you've gone through this entire spreadsheet, the next thing that you're going to put together is let's talk a little bit about this price negotiation. So again, if you're a contractor watching this, you've never put together an IGE, or if you are a professional services firm, maybe this is the first time you're trying to put together an IGE. What this is part of the IGE process is to, again, provide this record, provide this framework so that we know that we're spending this taxpayer money wisely. And so I think I mentioned a PNO, a pre-negotiation objective, or an RON, a record of negotiation. These are just terms that certain agencies will use. Again, I'm familiar with those too, but it could be called just an IGE letter. This is more of the narrative that actually spells out what we found in the estimate. I think we talked about it earlier. Column 1 is going to be the contractor's price. Column 2 is going to be the IGE price. Column 3 is going to be the difference between them. And then there's going to be a notes section. So this is another template that I found online. But what's the task order information? When does it start? When does it finish? Who's the agency and the buyer? What's the duration that this modification is going to take place on? What's some of the background information? Hey, we realized our window was on the wrong side of the building, so we had to move it for whatever reason. This provides context. It provides accountability to the project team. It provides just a really well-documented letter so that everybody can go back 6-8 months from now, 6-8 years from now, and understand why did we spend an extra $250,000 on this project, right? On Tuesday the 30th, the contractor found this issue that led to 6 different RFIs, and that's kind of what put us here, right? So it's just us being diligent and us being professional in how we build the case for this extra money, this extra work that we're performing. When we get to the negotiation objectives, this one's a little different than what I'm used to, but the negotiation objectives break down each individual component of the estimates, contractor's estimate and the IGE, 2 separate documents. They take those and they go point by point. So in this one, it talks about the shell rental rate, or the building, the tenant improvement costs, amortization rates. This is more for like a leased space. If we went back and looked at this, our pre-negotiation objectives would be labor, equipment, software, materials, those type of things. It would just be categorized into these very easily manageable segments of the bids that were compiled together, and it gives us a starting point to start this to end. Description of the acquisition. Listen, this is all just kind of boilerplate information that's going to be modified and tailored for your specific scenario. But what's going to happen is, as this letter is filled out, you are going to have this list of pre-negotiation objectives. We're going to be working off the same numbers. Everybody sees the numbers, and we're going to see the discrepancies. So this goes to the next phase in this overall process, where we come together and we have our meeting to discuss and to negotiate these prices further. So step 1 is going to be looking at those prices and just seeing which ones are high, low. Typically, there's a percentage. I want to say it's within 10 to 15% in most cases. Some cases it could be less. Some cases it could be more. But that's probably a good rule of thumb. If you're higher than 10 to 15%, there's probably an issue, right? There's probably something that somebody missed, good or bad. So if you fall within that threshold, a lot of times a federal agency will they will accept the pricing as is, and they'll just move on, in some cases if they have the money available. But again, if you fall outside of that range, if your prices are higher or lower, or if there's a real big discrepancy there, now we have to start to negotiate. Now we have to kind of drill down and dig into this a little bit more and say, okay, well, why is this number incorrect? Is there something that we've missed? Do we need to look at the design again? What has to happen? All these kind of questions naturally will come up. So within the IGE process, when you've reached this stage, that's why they call it a pre-negotiation objectives. It's kind of like a phase 1 of the negotiation. Basically, what's going to happen at this phase is, when you've outlined your discrepancies, you're going to then go back to the drawing board and come out of this meeting with essentially a list of items, 2, 3, 5, 1,000. I don't know how many items you're going to have on your list. But the government will ask, simple questions, and they'll say, well, I need to see a better breakout of your material pricing. I need to see, how did you calculate your mandate calculations in your schedule? I need to see, what did you, anything that relates to the work. I need more information. Same thing with contractor. Maybe the contractor's price came in really low, leads to questions. I need to understand, what was this, right? It's a back and forth. It's a negotiation. That's something to really keep in mind is, it's not just a situation where you're just told what to do as the contractor, or if you're a government POC watching this, there has to be some of that back and forth, right? Because we're all trying to reach the same objective. We're trying to move the ball down the field and to build this thing. And essentially coming out of this meeting, when you have your list of items that you have to go back, you have to rework or elaborate on or check your numbers on or whatever, this is really your chance to any other questions, do any other information, like really drill down, because what's going to happen is essentially at another predetermined time, all parties are going to reconvene. They're going to look at this, and this will be, sort of your final meeting to basically say what the government will accept, what they won't accept, right? It's a chance for you as a contractor to make your case for X percentage or whatever the dollar value is. Same thing on the government side. This is your chance to really spell out, well, this was already included in your base contract. We've just swapped out from the color blue on the wall to now it's the color red. You're not entitled to additional labor and 450 calendar days. This is uh, essentially a mining cost. That's in a nutshell sort of how all these meetings take place. And again, it often seems more maybe tricky than what it actually is. But at the end of the day, it is just a negotiation. It's really, how did we get here? What do we need to do to move forward? And as you begin to put together these, either the IGE, the independent side, or if you put together these estimates on the contractor side, just keep some of these things in mind. That again, I would strongly encourage you to just maintain that good line of communication, the good working relationship with your contracting officer, with your government POC, with whoever it is. Because at the end of the day, again, it's not meant to be punitive, and it's also not meant to be just a way to recoup costs that you might have missed otherwise, right? It's how do we make a scalable, repeatable framework in ensuring that this money is spent correctly in the right way for the right reason. So hope this has been helpful. Obviously, if you have any other questions, I know I kind of skimmed through some of these documents here, but if you have any questions about maybe your specific templates that you're using, a specific circumstance that you're going through, again, either on the contractor side or even on the government side, these are just some of the things that we've seen. And I think it's something that it's often kind of shrouded a little bit. Most people haven't really been a part of one of these before. And so hopefully these things that we've talked about today have been helpful and can kind of steer you in the right direction, whatever your approach to either put one of these together or to be a part of that sort of back and forth negotiation. So thank you so much. Have a great day.